She took a job cooking for cowboys on a ranch, not knowing one of them owned the land they stood on. Snow fell in heavy sheets across the Montana plains, muffling the world in a silence as sharp as the cold itself. December had its claws deep in the earth, frosting the brittle grass and clinging to the beams of the Willow Creek Ranch like an old grief. The wind tore through the yard, rattling shingles loose and stinging any skin foolish enough to be bare. May walked straight into it. Her coat was too thin, patched at the elbows, and her gloves didn't match. One wool, one cracked leather, but her back stayed straight and her eyes carried the hard, burning look of someone with nothing left to lose. A weathered satchel swung at her side, and her boots cut clean marks into the frozen mud. She stopped in front of the cookhouse where a knot of cowboys huddled near the open fire, passing a flask between them. Their laughter thinned as she approached, fading entirely as they took in the sight of her, a lone woman in a place that gave nothing without a fight. One man stepped forward. He was taller than the rest, older too, with a beard salted by years and suspicion carved deep into his features. His voice was gravel with a splash of whiskey. "This here's a working ranch, miss. Not a place for strays or stories." "I'm not a stray," May said, her voice low but steady. "And I'm not here to spin stories." His gaze traveled over her like a slow judgment. "We don't need trouble. We don't hire liars. And we sure as hell don't keep girls who think they can talk their way out of winter." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not here to charm anyone." Another man, heavier in the shoulders and meaner in the eyes, spat into the snow. "Looks like she's straight from a saloon kitchen, if not the upstairs room." A ripple of crude laughter moved through the group until the first man raised his hand for silence. He closed the space between them until they stood nearly nose to nose. "Then tell me, what do you want?" May didn't blink. "I can cook," she said, her voice sharp as a struck match. "I've worked cast iron over an open fire, skin game, baked sourdough in blizzards. I've made soup from bare bones and had men thank me for it after." He paused, the fire crackling behind him. "Where are you from?" She didn't answer. "This isn't a place for secrets," he pressed. "I can cook," she said again, lifting her chin. "And I'm not walking away." For a moment, the wind filled the space between them. Then he stepped aside, nodding toward the cookhouse. "We've got 36 men riding out the winter and haven't had a proper meal in 2 days. Stove's inside. You want the job? Prove it by morning. I'll need flour, salt, a dry towel," she said. "And it wouldn't kill you to show a little respect." His mouth twitched, half a laugh, half a grunt. "We'll see about that last part." As May stepped past him toward the door, she scanned the group again. Most turned away. A few smirked. Some frowned. But one man didn't move at all. He leaned against a post, arms folded, his coat black and his brimmed hat low enough to shadow his eyes. Only the sharp line of his jaw and the faint, unreadable light in his gaze showed. He didn't mock her, didn't speak, just watched. May met his eyes for a moment too long before pushing open the cookhouse door. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of old grease. Rust-spotted pots lined the sideboards, and a few empty tins lay scattered like discarded soldiers. But the stove stood tall in the corner, and something stubborn inside her flickered back to life. She hung her satchel on a hook, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Outside, the man in the black coat, Jonas, kept his arms folded. He had known her face before she spoke. Years ago, in Billings, he'd seen her behind the kitchen doors of the Rose Bell, a painted-up place where good men lied to themselves and left their morals at the door. He remembered the night she was dragged into the room, accused of something small, stealing a drink, maybe, or simply standing too proud. A man twice her size had grabbed her wrist. She hadn't screamed or begged. She had stood straight, eyes like fire, daring anyone to strike if they meant it. Jonas had watched from the shadows and done nothing. And now she was here, snow in her hair, and that same defiance in every step. He said nothing, turned toward the bunkhouse, and let the firelight die behind him. A storm was coming, outside and in, and it carried her name. By the time the night had thinned into the pale blue of morning, the scent of cooking drifted out of the cookhouse and threaded through the yard. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying with it the smell of frying bacon, fresh bread, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon upright. The cowboys shuffled in one by one, drawn more by their stomachs than curiosity. They found May already at the stove, hair tied back with a strip of cloth, moving with the quiet focus of someone who'd done this 100 times. Her hands were steady, her sleeves rolled, her cheeks touched by the stove's heat. She ladled thick stew into tin bowls, potatoes, beans, and what looked like fresh venison. Nobody asked where she'd gotten the meat. A basket of golden biscuits sat at the center of the table, and a kettle of coffee steamed beside them. The tall man from yesterday, Harlan, took the first bite. He chewed slowly, swallowed, then glanced toward her. His face didn't give much away, but he didn't spit it out either. That was approval enough for the rest, who dug in with the hunger of men who'd been living on little more than jerky and bad luck. The only one who didn't sit was Jonas. He lingered at the doorway, hat still low, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "You not eating?" May asked without looking up. "I've already eaten," he said. His voice was even, almost bored, but something in it carried weight. Harlan glanced between them. "You're welcome to join us, Jonas. Hell, it's the first decent meal we've had all month." Jonas didn't move. His gaze stayed on May, measuring. "I know who you are." The clatter of spoons against tin stilled for half a beat. May's hand didn't falter as she poured coffee into Harlan's cup. "Is that so?" she said. "I remember you from Billings." The Rose Bell. His tone wasn't cruel, just certain. "You served whiskey with a smile and a side of trouble." A couple of the men chuckled under their breath. May set the kettle down. "That was a long time ago. Long enough to run," Jonas replied. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air tighter. She didn't rise to his bait. Instead, she turned her back to him and reached for another loaf of bread. "Doesn't matter where I was," she said. "I'm here now. And here, I'm the cook." Jonas studied her for another moment before stepping aside, letting two more men pass through the door. "We'll see how long you stay." He walked away without taking a single bite. Harlan cleared his throat and addressed the others. "Eat up. We ride in an hour." May didn't watch Jonas go. She didn't need to. His presence lingered like the shadow of an approaching storm. Still, as she cleaned the counter, she caught herself glancing out the small window toward the corral, where he stood tightening a saddle strap, the wind tugging at his coat. He didn't look back, but she knew he was thinking the same thing she was. Whatever had started between them in another time, in another place, was far from over. The sun had barely climbed over the ridge when the crew mounted up, their horses restless under the pull of leather and the bite of cold morning air. The land stretched in all directions, dusty gullies, brittle grass, and the sharp silhouettes of distant buttes. It felt like riding across the surface of an old coin, worn, scarred, and holding secrets no one could quite make out. May stood at the fence line, arms folded, watching them prepare. The men moved with the quiet rhythm of routine, checking saddles, adjusting cinches, securing rifles in their scabbards. Harlan gave her a nod as he swung into the saddle. Jonas didn't so much as glance her way. They set off in a loose line, hooves thudding in uneven harmony, the sound carrying for miles in the stillness. May followed their shapes until they were little more than shadows against the rising sun, then turned toward the cookhouse. But her mind stayed with them, particularly with one man in a black coat who rode a little apart from the rest. Out on the open trail, the cold air sharpened the men's thoughts. No one spoke much, the silence filled with the sound of bridles creaking and the occasional snort from a horse. Jonas rode near the rear, scanning the horizon like a man expecting trouble. Around midday, they reached the canyon edge, a wide scar in the earth, jagged and deep, with a river glinting faintly far below. Harlan signaled for the group to dismount. They tied the horses to scrub brush and made their way toward a cluster of rocks that gave a view of the opposite rim. "There," Harlan said, pointing. Across the gap, faint smoke curled upward from a patch of cottonwoods. "That's where they've been holed up." Jonas crouched beside him, eyes narrowing. "You sure it's them?" Harlan gave him a look. "I'm sure." One of the younger men shifted uneasily. "How many you reckon?" "Enough to cause trouble," Harlan said. "That's why we wait for nightfall. They'll have fires going, maybe a few guards half asleep." We'll cross down at the bend and come up from behind." Jonas said nothing, but his gaze stayed locked on the drifting smoke. There was no fear in his expression, just calculation, like a man weighing odds in a game he couldn't afford to lose. By the time they made camp a half-mile from the crossing point, the sky had turned copper with sunset. The men built a small fire low to the ground, its light barely more than a glow. They ate jerky and biscuits in silence, the air tense with the unspoken fact that by morning, some of them might not ride back the same. Jonas kept to the edge of the firelight, hands resting loosely on his knees, listening to the wind sweep over the canyon. He thought about May, back at the ranch, ladling out stew to men who would never know the danger creeping this way. And he wondered, not for the first time, if bringing trouble to this land was worth the price it might demand. The night settled in slow and heavy, smothering the canyon in darkness. The wind carried a faint scent of juniper and cold stone, whispering through the gullies like something alive. The fire had long since been stamped out, and the men moved quietly, their breath visible in the chill. Jonas tightened the strap on his satchel, then checked the revolver at his hip. He didn't need to glance at Harlan to know the man was already watching him, reading his movements the way one gambler sizes up another. "Stay close," Harlan murmured. They began the descent at the narrow bend, the trail little more than a seam of loose shale and jagged outcroppings. The canyon walls rose high above, cutting out the moonlight, turning the path into a tunnel of black and silver. A horse stumbled on the slope, the clatter of hooves echoing, but the men froze until the sound faded. When they reached the riverbed, the water whispered past their boots, icy enough to bite through leather. Jonas felt the pull of the current, but kept his eyes forward. The far bank rose steep, but they climbed it in silence, each man's breath ragged by the time they crested the ridge. Up ahead, through the thin veil of cottonwoods, the enemy camp flickered in muted gold. Shapes moved around the fire, 3 men visible, maybe more in the shadows. The smoke climbed straight into the night, unbroken by wind. Harlan raised his hand, signaling the others to spread out. Jonas took the far left, slipping between boulders until the firelight caught just the edge of his coat. He could hear low voices, men speaking without urgency, as if convinced they were safe out here. From where he crouched, Jonas saw more than he liked. 2 rifles propped against a log, a scatter of empty bottles, and beyond the fire, a faint shape that might have been a wagon. He couldn't see who or what was inside, but something about it made the back of his neck tighten. Harlan gave the sign. The silence broke like glass, boots thudding against dirt, the hiss of steel leaving leather, shouts exploding into the night. Jonas surged forward, the world narrowing to firelight, faces, and the sudden burn of adrenaline in his blood. One man lunged for the rifles, but Jonas was faster, kicking the weapon aside before grabbing the stranger by the collar and driving him backward. Somewhere to his right, he heard Harlan's voice, sharp, commanding, cutting through the chaos. In less than a minute, it was over. 2 men lay face down in the dirt, hands bound. Another sat slumped against the wagon wheel, groaning. Jonas turned toward the wagon. The canvas flaps stirred in the wind, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement inside. He took a step forward. "Leave it," Harlan said, his voice flat. Jonas hesitated. The image of that faint shift in the shadows burned into his mind. But he obeyed. For now, they broke camp before the first hint of dawn, the sky still an unbroken swath of black. The prisoners were tied to a single rope, stumbling as Harlan urged them forward. Frost clung to the grass, crunching softly beneath their boots. Jonas kept glancing at the wagon, the question gnawing at him. He hadn't imagined it. There had been something inside. Every time the trail curved, he maneuvered closer, pretending to check the rear wheel or the tarp straps, but catching glimpses of movement beneath the canvas. The others seemed too focused on the road ahead to notice. Harlan rode point, his broad shoulders stiff with vigilance. The air was brittle and cold, their breath puffing in pale clouds. The horses snorted and tossed their heads, eager to be rid of the weight they hauled. By midday, the sun had burned off the frost, and the canyon gave way to a plateau brushed in gold grass. Jonas fell back alongside the wagon, his voice low. "Who's in there?" The prisoner tied nearest to him smirked through a split lip. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Jonas's jaw tightened, but before he could press further, Harlan called for a halt. They dismounted in the shadow of a rock outcrop, letting the horses drink from a shallow stream. Jonas took the opportunity to circle to the back of the wagon. The canvas shifted again, slow, almost cautious. He reached for the flap. "Don't." Harlan's voice came from behind him, sharper this time. "You open that, and the deal's off." Jonas turned. "Deal? What deal?" Harlan's expression was carved from stone, the kind that keeps us breathing. The others gave no sign they'd heard, but Jonas noticed one of them, a wiry man with a crooked hat, watching closely from the edge of the camp. When they moved on, Jonas kept his eyes forward, but the thought dug in deep. Whatever Harlan was protecting in that wagon, it was more important than the prisoners, the mission, maybe even their lives. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere far ahead. The wagon wheels groaned over uneven rock, and Jonas clenched his fists, making a silent promise. Sooner or later, he'd find out what, or who, was under that canvas. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened into a heavy ceiling of gray, the light dimming until it felt closer to dusk than day. The wind cut sharper now, carrying the metallic tang of coming rain. They pushed on until the trail narrowed between jagged cliffs, the wagon wheels jolting over deep ruts. The prisoners trudged in silence, fatigue etched in their faces, their shackles clinking in rhythm with the horses' hooves. Jonas scanned the walls of stone on either side. This was a perfect place for an ambush, and the thought settled uneasily in his gut. Harlan seemed to sense it too. His hand rested on his rifle, eyes constantly moving. The first drop of rain hit Jonas's cheek, then another. Within minutes, the sky opened, and the downpour was relentless, drumming against the wagon canvas and soaking their coats. The road turned to slick mud, the horses straining to keep their footing. They rounded a bend, and Jonas caught sight of a lone figure ahead, standing in the middle of the trail. The man was tall, wrapped in a dark oilskin coat, his hat pulled low against the rain. He didn't move as they approached. Harlan raised a hand, signaling the group to slow. "Stay sharp," he muttered. When they drew within 20 feet, the stranger finally spoke, his voice low but carrying over the rain. "You've got something that don't belong to you." The words hit like a blade between the ribs. Jonas glanced at Harlan, but the man's expression didn't change, only his jaw tightened. "I think you've mistaken us for someone else," Harlan said evenly. The stranger tilted his head, water running in rivulets from the brim of his hat. "No mistake. Hand it over, and maybe you all walk away." Jonas's pulse thudded in his ears. This wasn't about the prisoners. It was about the wagon, about what was inside. Before anyone could reply, lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that rattled the canyon walls. In that brief flash of light, Jonas thought he saw the man's hand resting on the butt of a revolver. The rain kept falling. No one moved. The air was thick with the sense that one wrong word could turn it into a killing ground. The standoff stretched long enough for the rain to pool in the wagon ruts. Water trickled down Jonas's collar, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the stranger's hand near that revolver. Harlan didn't flinch. "You've got 5 seconds to get off this trail," he said, his tone calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. The stranger's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. 1. He counted back, slow and deliberate. Jonas felt the prisoners shifting uneasily, their chains clinking in nervous rhythm. One of the guards stepped closer to Harlan, but no one drew yet. The air was too brittle. Any sudden move would shatter it into chaos. 2. The man said, taking a half step forward. The rain pattered against the brim of his hat, dripping from its edge like the tick of a clock. 3. The crack of gunfire tore through the sound of the storm. Jonas didn't even see who fired first, only the flash, the echo bouncing off the canyon walls. Horses reared, prisoners dropped low, and shouts drowned beneath the roar of rain. Jonas dove behind the wagon, mud splashing up his back. Another shot rang out, this one closer. He peeked around the wheel just in time to see the stranger stagger, a dark stain spreading across his coat. But even wounded, the man didn't fall. He drew his gun, returning fire with steady aim. A bullet slammed into the wagon's side, inches from Jonas's head, splintering the wood. Harlan barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. Two men flanked right, rifles raised. The stranger, realizing his odds were slipping, backed toward the shadows between the cliffs. For a moment, Jonas thought it was over. Then, as the man vanished into the rain, Jonas caught it. A quick, almost desperate glance toward the wagon. Not at the prisoners. Not at them. At whatever was under that canvas. Jonas's breath came hard, the taste of gunpowder sharp on his tongue. The fight was over, but the questions had only deepened. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, the kind that clung to everything and turned the air cold. Steam rose faintly from the horses as they shifted restlessly, their flanks slick and dark. The canyon felt emptier now, though the tension still hung there like smoke after a fire. Two of Harlan's men checked the wagon for damage, while the others dragged a wounded prisoner back to his feet. The stranger was gone, swallowed by the cliffs and the rain. Jonas stepped to the wagon's side, his boots squelching in the mud. His eyes drifted to the flap of the canvas, now torn from a bullet strike. For just a moment, the wind lifted it, revealing the edge of a wooden crate. There was no mark on it, no clue as to what it held, but something about its presence made Jonas's chest tighten. Whatever was inside had been worth blood and might yet cost more. Harlan came up beside him, following his gaze. "Don't start wondering," he said quietly. "Wondering gets you in trouble." Jonas looked at him, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Seems to me trouble already found us." Harlan's mouth twitched, almost like he wanted to answer, but instead he moved away, calling for the men to move out. The wagon creaked forward, wheels cutting deep into the wet earth. Jonas mounted his horse, falling in behind. The trail ahead was slick, the sky still brooding. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, as if the storm wasn't finished with them yet. And neither, Jonas thought, was whatever was hiding under that canvas.